I'm Colleen Sheehan. I'm director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good here at Villanova. We're located in Old Halsey, 304. So if you don't mind climbing a few steps, you are welcome to come by, share in conversation and goodwill. So you are welcome anytime. The Ryan Center is devoted to an understanding of the principles and practices of the American Republic and of constitutional democracies in general. We want to know what citizenship is and what are our responsibilities. And we even want to know what leadership means in a substantive sense. And the old term usage was called statesmanship, or perhaps stateswomanship. And so it's not just about leading nary anywhere that the feeling might bring us, but how do we think about leading in political life for a particular purpose? And what does that purpose have to do with the principles of our particular regime? So if you're interested in these kinds of questions, as well as questions about theology and politics, literature and politics, and so forth, please join us. The undergraduates meet every Wednesday evening at 7:30, Jen? 7:30? And they run it. Each week they select a different topic. Last night was on school choice. There is often, and I should say always, I think, pizza. So come and join in the debates that they put on, conversations that they take part in every week. Graduate students and some undergraduate students meet on Tuesday evenings to discuss usually a little bit more theoretical issues, usually short articles. Recently it was Churchill's piece from his great contemporaries on Lawrence of Arabia. There's some talk that it might be on what you were talking about today, Stephen, from Robert Frost on a couple of his poems on faith and reason next week. So we do that. We put on lectures. We have fellowships. Our visiting senior fellow this year is Dr. William D. Allen, former chairman of the United States Civil Rights Commission. We have faculty associates, many of whom are here, Dr. Satterfield, Mr. Beauvais, Dr. Daly, and JP Spiro, and others. I hope I'm not missing anyone. So that's what the Ryan Center is. Today it's my pleasure to welcome back to Villanova, Dr. Stephen Grosby. Stephen was here with us in the 90s, 91 to 95, Stephen. He was a instructor in the Department of Political Science and then in Core Humanities, what is now called ACS. Dr. Grosby is a professor of religion at Clemson University. He received his PhD from the Committee on Social Thought from the University of Chicago, and his areas of research interest include the ancient Near East, the Hebrew Bible, the relationship between religion and nationality, and social and political thought in general. Some of his recent works include, and these are just recent works, Dr. Grosby is a very prolific scholar. Nationalism, a very short introduction. Biblical Ideas of Nationality, Ancient and Modern. And in addition, translation of Hans Fryer's Theory of Objective Mind, an introduction to the philosophy of culture. He's also edited a book by Edward Shills, who was his teacher at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Social Thought, on civility. And I know no one who is more of a scholar and a gentleman than Dr. Grosby. I want to tell you one quick story. When Professor Shills visited his alma mater, University of Pennsylvania, a number of years ago, I had the opportunity to meet him, and we were walking down the streets of Philadelphia, Dr. Grosby, Dr. Shills, and myself. And we sort of let Stephen lag behind or get ahead, I forget which it was at one point, and Dr. Shills leaned over to me and he said, You know Ms. Sheehan. Dr. Crosby is my best student. Let me introduce you, please, to Dr.
Thank you, Professor Sheehan. It is really a pleasure to be back at Villanova, and I thank you for the beautiful fall day as well. Here is one definition of a professor. It may not be a fair definition, but nonetheless. A professor is someone who says in 45 minutes what could have been said in 5 minutes. If you want the 5-minute version, please read the editorial that I wrote in yesterday's Philadelphia Inquirer. But now for the 45-minute version. In both Proverbs 8 and John 1, there is an intriguing description of a certain kind of knowledge that existed before the creation of the world. Here is from Proverbs 8. The Lord created me, wisdom, at the beginning of his course as the first of his works of old. In the distant past, I, wisdom, was fashioned before the origin of the earth. I was there when he, the Lord, set the heavens into place, when he fixed the horizon upon the deep, when he made the heavens above firm and the foundations of the deep gush forth. When he fixed the foundations of the earth, I, wisdom, was with him as a confidant. Then in John 1, as you know, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. How we are to understand this wisdom in Proverbs 8 of the Old Testament and the Word of John 1 of the New Testament is not entirely clear. We wonder if there might be a relation between this pre-existent wisdom as described in Proverbs 8 and the pre-existent Word as described in John 1. However we might address this problem, I think we can agree that the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and published by 1788, were not part of this pre-existent wisdom or Word. I will not take up what is frankly a more difficult question as to whether or not the central ideas conveyed by the Federalist Papers might have been part of that pre-existent wisdom or Word. In any event, we have no evidence that Moses had read the Federalist Papers. Why is it important to keep in mind that Moses had not read the Federalist Papers? Perhaps this question, and understandably so, appears frivolous. Moses had not read the Federalist Papers. So let me reformulate the question in a way that it becomes less frivolous. We are interested in how our traditions of liberty developed, so that we might better understand what we mean by our use of the term liberty or freedom. Because of this interest, we study ancient Greek history and philosophy, Roman history, the history of the common law, and the Federalist Papers. However, those interested in the development of our traditions of liberty should also study the Old Testament. After all, the world did not begin in ancient Athens. Moreover, those interested in understanding better our traditions of liberty should especially study the Old Testament. Why? Because during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, many writers turned to the Old Testament for a better understanding of what a nation that upheld freedom should look like. Nevertheless, when we study the Old Testament, we must be on guard against finding clear expressions of our constitutional arrangements there as if Moses had read the Federalist Papers. In other words, we must be as self-conscious as possible about our own assumptions when reading the Old Testament. Those assumptions should not run roughshod over the plain meaning of the Old Testament. It is certainly possible that we find in the Old Testament a conception of freedom that should not surprise us. For the first appearance of the term freedom, we do not have to turn to the ancient Greek word eleutheria, as it appears, for example, in Herodotus' The History and Aristotle's The Politics. And there was an influx, too, from the country villages of people to whom the rule of one man was more welcome than freedom, from Herodotus. And here's the reference from Aristotle: the city is a partnership of free persons. The fact of the matter is that terms that we translate as freedom are to be found much earlier than the appearance in these Greek texts. In the long history of ancient Mesopotamian civilization of the ancient Near East, we find two terms that expressed an idea of liberty: the Sumerian term amargi and the Akkadian term anduraru. And I'll just provide a few examples. Here's from the Sumerian amargi. He amnestied the inhabitants of Lagash who were imprisoned because of the debts which they had incurred, or because of the barley claimed by the palace for its stores, or because of the theft, murder, and set them free. I want to emphasize here that it could be, instead of "and set them free," and restored them. There's another possible way of translating it. And here is another example of the Akkadian word from the Atrahasis, this is worth writing down because this is the Mesopotamian account of the flood. And it's interesting to read it and see in what ways it differs from Genesis 6 through 9. In any event, I have removed you, the lower gods' heavy work. I've imposed your toil on man. You raised a cry for mankind to do your work. So I have loosed the yoke. I've established your freedom. Again, this could have also been translated, and I have made restoration. I've restored you to your previous condition before the lower gods had to do the work of the big shots, the big gods. In these two examples, the terms convey a meaning of freedom as the lifting of an imposed burden. For example, taxation or forced labor, thereby restoring the individual, or in this case the lower gods, to a state before the burden was imposed. These terms could just as well have been translated as restoration or relief. Now, these terms do not seem to convey a somewhat different meaning of freedom with which we are familiar. A meaning of freedom where the individual is free to do as he or she wishes, where one can start an activity with the hope that doing so will transform one's environment. I am not arguing that the translation of these two terms as freedom is incorrect. I'm only observing that this ancient Mesopotamian conception of freedom appears to have been limited to relief from external coercion, so that an earlier condition, before the burden was imposed, is restored. In this sense, it corresponds to our use of the verb to liberate. It is a rather traditionalist understanding of freedom. What I mean by a traditionalist understanding of freedom is where one is restored to a previous condition before a burden was imposed. Once the burden is removed, one is able to follow previously established paths. Now let me now turn to freedom in the Old Testament. Before I do, how many saw the new Exodus movie with Christian Bale? Anybody? No one's seen it? That's a very good thing. It's a terrible, terrible movie. I never thought I would see the day when a movie would make infinitely better The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. But this movie succeeds. In any event, as you know from the account of Exodus, the idea of freedom in the Old Testament is most famously conveyed by the phrase, "Let my people go," in Exodus, chapters 5, 7, 8, and 9. However, there too we must examine this idea of freedom if we are to understand it, how it is used. The appearance of this phrase, "let my people go," in these chapters is qualified. The Israelites are to be free from Egyptian slavery so that they may worship the Lord. And say to him, "Pharaoh, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me, Moses, to you to say, 'Let my people go,' so that they may worship me in the wilderness." Let us see if the two Hebrew words that we translate as freedom are also used in the same way. That is, are they qualified? We get a good sense of the first term from the biblical law codes. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free. That's the Hebrew word there, without payment. The same sense of this term is conveyed in the prophets, and here's Isaiah. "Untie the cords of the yoke to let the oppressed go free." The important point I'm trying to emphasize here is that in the first case it's a slave, in the second case it's the oppressed, slaves, who should be restored to a previous condition. As with the earlier Mesopotamian ancient Near East terms, this conception of freedom appears to be limited to the relief of a burden so that an earlier condition before the burden was imposed is restored. The second term appears to convey the same meaning. "He, the Lord, has sent me as a herald of joy to the humble, to bind up the wounded of the heart, to proclaim freedom to the captives." Note that they're captives, and then when they become free, they will be restored to their previous condition before they were captives. Similarly, in Jeremiah, where we have both terms, the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to proclaim freedom among them, that everyone should set free his Hebrew slaves. While I have translated the above terms as freedom, they could just as well have been translated, and in fact often are translated, as release. That is, to proclaim release of a slave or captive. Both of these Hebrew terms convey a meaning of restoration of an earlier condition. As with the Mesopotamian terms, the translation of these two Hebrew words as freedom or liberty is defensible. But we should recognize that the meaning conveyed by this freedom is not the same as the freedom to pursue a different or new path, or even to do as one wishes, as evidently conveyed by the phrase from early American history, "Don't tread on me." The ancient Mesopotamians and Israelites were not libertarians. They do not appear to have had a developed understanding of freedom as expressed in the First Amendment. That is, the idea of pre-political rights to speak freely, assemble freely, and to worship as one sees fit. Now, clearly, these two conceptions of freedom may converge. One will not be free to start a new activity if one is burdened by heavy taxation, or if one is a captive or a slave. One must first be restored to a condition before the burden was imposed, before one can set off to do what one wishes. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that these terms from the ancient Near East appear to convey a meaning of freedom as a restoration of a condition before a burden was imposed. Within our use of the term of freedom today lurks two meanings. One, the restoration of a previous condition, as conveyed by those terms from the ancient Near East and the Old Testament. And two, the ability to start something new. It is important to recognize that these two different meanings in our use of the term freedom and how it differs from how the term is used in the ancient Near East, if we are to understand properly the description of Moses in the Old Testament. If we do not recognize this difference, our reading the Old Testament may assume too much or too little. All right. My primary purpose so far in these remarks is to emphasize the virtue of modesty. In this case, when reading the Old Testament, we should do so with an intellectual humility. we have to read the Old Testament slowly and with care, and while doing so, trying to be aware of our assumptions. I ought to add, in passing, the same approach is required when reading the New Testament. For example, when reading Acts, who among us proceeds slowly and with care so that the odd, seemingly unimportant phrase forces its way into our attention? Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. But what is a Sabbath day's journey? We find no answer to that question anywhere in the Old or New Testaments. Where do we find an explanation for what a Sabbath day's journey is? We find it in the laws compiled by the Jewish rabbis. Now, might this passing, even casual use of this phrase, Sabbath day's journey, by the author of Acts indicate that he was not only familiar with, but possibly approached the world through categories that are not altogether, that we are today not altogether familiar with? And if so, how would knowing this influence our reading of the New Testament? If we agree that we should approach the Bible with an intellectual humility by being aware as much as we can of the assumptions that we bring to the reading of the Old and New Testaments, then perhaps we should pay greater attention to those verses in the Old Testament that we tend to read quickly or, more often than not, skip over. It is understandable that we pay attention to passages in the Old Testament that appear to speak directly to us, rightly or wrongly. We assume we understand well enough the account of the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, or Ecclesiastes, or the use of the term freedom, but perhaps it will be more illuminating for our understanding of the Old Testament to pay closer attention to those verses that we ignore. Consider, for example, two straightforward verses from Deuteronomy that are rarely commented upon, but I think richly deserve our attention. So, there shall be an area for you outside the camp where you may relieve yourself. With your gear you shall have a spike, and when you have squatted, you shall dig a hole with it and cover up your excrement. This is in the law code section of Deuteronomy. What is this? This is a law for the use of latrine. The ancient Israelites were not supposed to have anything unseemly in their camp. For if there was something unseemly, God would turn away from the Israelites. This is obvious. However, these verses are also a very clear expression that the orientation of the Old Testament is of the proper organization of life in this world. The Old Testament is preoccupied with life in this world, so much so as to provide even a law for the use of a latrine. Of course, one may or may not be critical of that preoccupation. Today, I'm not going to take up the limitations or problems with such an orientation. I'm concerned here with just simply pointing out that one must read the Old Testament with care. Recognizing that the orientation of the Old Testament is the proper organization of life in this world must be kept front and center if one wishes to understand what one is reading there. There are numerous consequences of this orientation. Some are theological. For example, how to account for the harshness of life irrespective of how properly that life is organized. I won't pursue these theological consequences today. Other consequences are pressingly relevant for the subject of these remarks, however. What are the consequences of the Old Testament's preoccupation with life in this world? One obvious consequence is a concern with how life is to be organized in this world. If this is so, then it means that law and politics can't be avoided. Law and politics as expressions of the organization of life in this world are not and could not be of secondary or passing concerns of the Old Testament. That they are central to the Old Testament was obvious to many of the writers of the 16th, 17th, 18th century who looked beyond Greece and Rome to the Old Testament for guidance on how life should be organized legally and politically in this world. That they did so is why we refer to these writers as Christian Hebraists. And here are a few of some of the better-known scholars who turn to the Old Testament for these reasons. Once one recognizes this legal and political consequence of the orientation of the Old Testament, our reading of it takes on a different contour. Take law, for an example. Law is obviously a necessary means for the organization of life in this world. When one recognizes the importance of law, our understanding of otherwise well-known biblical accounts may change. We are familiar, for example, with the first several chapters of Genesis. The creation of the world in Genesis 1 and 2, the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, the murder of Abel in Genesis 4, the flood in chapters 6 through 9. I believe that many of you covered this material in your ACS seminars. I don't have to say seminars because the S stands for seminars, but ACS seminars. Yeah? All right. If we take care and proceed slowly, perhaps a different understanding of the structure of those chapters may emerge. Now, there are good textual reasons for concluding that creation begins anew after the flood. Why? Because Noah is implicitly described as being the new Adam. In Genesis 1, God blesses the first created human beings. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill or complete the earth and master it. However, the same verses appear in Genesis 9, only now the blessings are for Noah and his family. God blessed Noah and his sons and said, be fertile and increase, fill or complete the earth. And again in Genesis 9, verse 7. It thus seems clear that the blessings of Noah and his family are meant to recall the blessings of the first humans as described in Genesis 1. More. If there remains any doubt, and you're my doubting Thomas, yeah? If there remains any doubt that these verses in Genesis 9 are meant for the reader, that's us, to recall Genesis 1, the comparison of the descriptions of what humans are allowed to eat provides further support. God said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, they shall be yours. And then in Genesis 9, every moving thing that lives now shall be for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, well, that's the reference to Genesis 1, now I give you everything. True, in Genesis 9, there is a difference from Genesis 1. For in Genesis 9, we are now allowed to eat meat. However, the very reference in Genesis 9, verse 3, to having earlier given only plants for food should make it obvious that the reader of Genesis 9 is meant to recall Genesis 1. We as readers are meant to compare Genesis 9 with Genesis 1. Thus, we are dealing with a new creation, that is, the Noah as the new Adam. Finally, as if the relation between Genesis 1 and 9 were not already clear enough, the famous and important description of humanity in Genesis 1 is repeated in Genesis 9. So God created humankind in His image. In the image of God He created them. Male and female He created them. For in His own image God created humankind. So there's the repetition. Now, if it is clear that Noah was understood as the new Adam, and the answer to that is yes, it is clear, then two questions arise. Why was it necessary to have a new Adam? And what now is different? The answer to the first question about why it was necessary to have the new Adam is fairly straightforward, for after all, in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve were disobedient. In Genesis 4, we have the first murder. We read in Genesis 6 that 10 generations having passed, humanity's wickedness had become so great that God decided to destroy all living creatures and to begin again, or to begin anew with Noah. All right. Now to the second question. What is different? We have already noted that with the new Adam, Noah, we no longer have to be vegetarians. Which I'm going to assume is a good thing for most of us. Some people, think that's wrong, but okay. Now we can have, I'm obviously an old man, so you'll excuse this reference. Now we can have fish on Fridays. Yeah? All right. There is, however, another difference. In contrast to Genesis 1 and 2, in Genesis 9 we have an innovation beyond just being able to eat meat, without the blood, by the way. Something new and different appears that had been previously absent. What is new? Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed, for in His own image God created humankind. The question now becomes, how are we to understand this innovation, this prohibition against murder, the taking of human life? In answering the question of how we're to understand this innovation, let us return to our earlier remarks. I had noted earlier that the Old Testament is preoccupied with the proper ordering of life in the world. One consequence of this orientation is that legal and political concerns take on a pressing importance, including the use of latrine, with the legal requirements on how to use the latrine. With that recognition in mind, we may conclude that what is different with the new Adam, Noah, is that law is introduced into human affairs. We have here a legal prohibition that has been introduced into the world. Law is introduced into the world as a necessary bulwark, protection against human wickedness. This conclusion has an influence on how we read the Old Testament. I do not mean to say that the Old Testament is exclusively a legal textbook. Obviously, it is not, but there's a lot of law in it. I do mean to say that within the Old Testament is to be found laws for how human beings are to live together. What do these laws require? In laying out what these laws require, I think we should be modest. And here I want to return to that frivolous observation. We must not proceed as if Moses had read the Federalist Papers or the U.S. Constitution. I do not think, for example, that we find in the Old Testament a developed conception of a constitutional separation of powers as we find in the Federalist Papers and the U.S. Constitution. Although we do have some institutional differentiation, for example, between king and prophet. Nonetheless, I think we find several legal propositions clearly laid out in the Old Testament. One such principle is that no one is above the law, not even the king. When she, the Secretary of State, no, I was watching TV earlier today, the news. No, that's not. This is not a political presentation. When he, the king, has taken the throne, he shall have a copy of the law written for him. Let it remain with him, and let him read all his life to observe faithfully every word of this law and these statutes, neither raising himself above fellow Israelites nor turning aside from the law. One implication of this proposition is that the law exists separate from the king. The law is not what is promulgated by the king. In this sense, the law here is more similar to our tradition of common law than Roman law. Moreover, in the previous chapter of Deuteronomy, chapter 16, the Israelites are commanded to establish a judiciary with local courts and one central court. At these courts, when disputes arise, there must be a careful examination of the evidence, including testimony of multiple witnesses. This is to ensure just decisions. You should not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. There is a further clarification of what it means to judge fairly. You shall not render an unfair judgment. Do not be partial to the poor or defer to the rich. Judge your countrymen fairly. This latter verse insists upon equal treatment before the law, where no distinction is made between rich and poor. We thus can say at least this. 1, there is recognition in the laws of the Old Testament that no one should be above the law. 2, all should be subject to the law. And 3, that there should not be one law for the rich and one law for the poor, but the same law for everyone. We call this recognition the rule of law, and the rule of law is a necessary precondition for liberty. As I mentioned earlier, I do not think we find in the Old Testament a developed conception of the freedom of the individual as we today understand freedom. Once again, the ancient Israelites would not have voted for Ron Paul. We do, however, find a conception of the freedom of the nation of Israel. The unavoidable consequence of the command in Exodus to let my people go, to be free from Egyptian slavery, was that the nation of ancient Israel would become a national state. To have sovereignty would mean that Israel could act politically in the world. Today we call this unavoidable consequence the right of national self-determination. Ancient Israel's self-determination is the subject matter of the books of Joshua through 2 Kings. Winter break reading. And specifically the book of Samuel, chapters 8 through 10. The laws of Deuteronomy assume the existence of Israel as a national state. However, how that state was judged in the Old Testament and the history from 1 Samuel through 2 Kings is an entirely different matter, because it is a very sorry history. Throughout that approximately 500-year-long history, from King Saul to the Babylonian conquest of Judah, there is only one king to have been judged righteous. And that king is certainly not David or Solomon. It is King Josiah, whose reign we read about in 2 Kings chapter 23. For the most part, this history of ancient Israel as a national state is a history of the abuse of power. For example, David's arranged murder of a loyal soldier so that David's adultery would not be impeded. Solomon's murder of his brother and the other potential claimant to the throne. Ahab and Jezebel's theft of property and their murder of Naboth, and on and on. Despite these and other examples of abuse of power, we must once again proceed with caution. Our evaluation of this description of the abuse of power should not be unduly influenced by our understanding of constitutional checks and balances. We have no generalized political theory in the Old Testament. explicitly indicating skepticism about a state with concentrated power. We are instead dealing with the implications of the account. That does not mean, however, that there are no political teachings in the Old Testament, for the implications are there. In fact, it would be quite odd, even incomprehensible, if there were not these implications. This is especially so given how nuanced biblical law is in the description of the jurisdiction of its civil laws between the foreigner passing through the land of Israel, the foreigner who resides permanently in the land of Israel, and the Israelite born in the land of Israel. That there are political teachings, however implicit, presents us with the problem of a tension-filled combination. On the one hand, there is the recognition of the necessity of politics for life in this world. On the other hand, this recognition is combined with the unavoidable danger of concentrated power. This combination is a problem worthy of our careful consideration. I conclude these brief remarks today with an observation concerning liberty about which the Old Testament is, in fact, quite clear. Beginning with the count of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, as read in some of your humanities seminars, we have in the Old Testament a consistent opposition to empire. As you know, Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, accounts for why there are so many different languages in the world. Everyone on earth had the same language, and they said, "Come, let us build us a city and a tower in the sky to make a name for ourselves." The Lord said, "If as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound or confuse their speech there so that they shall not understand one another's speech." That is why the city, was called Babel, because there the Lord confused or confounded the speech of the whole earth. Especially in Genesis, there are a lot of puns going on to explain the origins of the word. Here, the origin of Babel is described as being from Bawal. I admit, not a very good pun, but however, the pun here to explain the origin of the word Babel, as the Hebrew word for confused is Balal, also indicates that the reader is meant to recall and reject the imperial ambitions of Babylon. And there we have a better pun. Yep. Babel, Babylon. I think that there should be no doubt that imperial ambition, whether Egyptian, let my people go, Assyrian, or Babylonian, is viewed in the Old Testament as a threat to liberty, certainly to the liberty of Israel. True enough, the focus of the opposition to imperial ambition is the freedom of the Israelite nation, and not the freedom of the individual. Nevertheless, the liberty of the nation has been an important part of our Western heritage and our American tradition, and it too remains worthy of our careful consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godfrey.
I don't know.
Question? I'll start off with one, if you don't mind, Stephen. You gave two different meanings of the word freedom for our day and age, and one was restoration, and the other was affecting something new, I think. Usually, I think when people think of freedom today, they tend to think of the absence of restraints. The absence of chains, the absence of restraints. So you have no obstacles in your path. How does that fit into those two definitions that you gave? And can you give an example of freedom as restoration?
Sure. Miss Foley? Oh, Miss Foley. Let me, I'm going to put it in Old Testament terms because it's a little bit ambiguous, hard translation. Miss Foley is my indentured servant. Well, that's really what they more often not mean by slave. You know, and she has a debt to me. I loaned her money and she didn't pay it back, so she's indebted to me, and I'm going to she has to, poor thing, she has to do my laundry for 7 years. So she's restrained. In 5 years, she's done it so well, and I feel so sorry for her. And with a circumcised, because I've read Jeremiah and Deuteronomy, with a circumcised heart, which let's say that means with mercy, I set you free, and by doing so, I restore her to her previous condition. The metaphorical chains have been taken off. So that's, and I think that's generally how the term is used. She's no longer my indentured servant or slave or captive. She is, in that sense, restored to a previous condition. In that sense, that's how we translate those terms as free, both in the ancient Mesopotamian terms and the biblical term. Separate from that is, Miss Foley, oh my God, it's not at Villanova, I know, but I can tell you where I am. Miss Foley, am my own person, so I am free, because I am my own person, to get a tattoo. Yeah. And that's a different. That's what the former I would call a more traditionalist conception of freedom, because she no longer has to do my laundry. She is free to go back and do what she had been doing previously before she became indentured to me. The other one I'm calling a more libertarian conception, where she sets her own ends to do what she wants, even though their ends, God forbid, are abhorrent.
This is not a tattoo type person.
Yeah? Yeah, okay. That's this. Now, of course, they come together. If she's my indentured servant living in my hut doing my laundry, she, of course, is not free to go off and get a tattoo. So in order to do the latter, she has to be restored to her previous condition of freedom of movement, where she's not confined to my hut doing my laundry.
So is the assumption there that freedom is a natural condition? Because to restore it means that that's what it was previously, or ought to have been?
It's not clear to me whether or not in the ancient Mesopotamian literature or in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there is an understanding of a natural condition, of pre-political, what we would today call pre-political rights. I'm not clear on that.
Well, restoration of what?
Restoration to a position where she is not confined to my hut doing my laundry. So she's restored to go back to her field to farm, or to do her husband, who's missed her for 5 years, to do his laundry. Well, that's the way guys are. Now, I don't think they. Oh, I don't think that's. If I can put it in your idiom, I don't think the ancient Israelites rolled that way. That by the way, but I would like to say, however, which is too often overlooked, there are 3 books in your Old Testament named after women. Yes? Ruth, Esther, and Judith. And, if you haven't read the book of Judith, well, how about to the young ladies in class, if you're going out with a guy and he does not like the figure Judith in the book of Judith in the Old Testament, dump him. That's a tease, an incentive to make sure you read the book of Judith. You can read very quickly through the first 7 chapters, because she doesn't appear yet until chapter 8.
Other questions? Yes. Jen.
how does freedom then work in terms of freedom of restoration, freedom of indentured servants being restored to the position? How does that work for a slave that was then freed? Someone was born into slavery, there's no restoration that can happen. There's no previous condition of freedom.
That's an extraordinarily fascinating, excellent question. And we have to look at the laws about that. And they differ from, let me, of course, the ancient, yes. What happens to the person who's actually born as a slave? And so what kind of condition are they being restored to? You know, and in general, in antiquity, and not just antiquity, if you're born as a slave, that's generally your lot in life until the English laws outlawing slavery, period. Okay? In the ancient Near East, the fate of the foreigner made into a slave during battle was not a happy lot. However, one has to look at the laws in detail and look at exceptions. They're really very fascinating. So, for example, Miss White. Miss White is captured, and this is actually ancient Israelite law. Miss White is captured as a slave. Okay? And, the ancient Israelite, really is quite taken with the pretty color of your hair. Yeah? Okay. So he says, well, you're my slave, and you're going to be mine. Yes? When you became his, you then have the rights of a wife, and if he says, I don't want you anymore, you leave as a free person. Yeah? So there are interesting complications which come up against your observation.
But then going back to what Dr. Sheen was saying about the natural state of freedom, that doesn't...
I can only tell you my view here. I'm skeptical about that, not only in the Old Testament, but anywhere in the ancient Near East. I don't think... one could argue, of course, that Adam and Eve had a natural state of freedom in the Garden of Eden. I think that argument has been made. And one could make that argument. It's not an argument that I'm particularly taken with. Okay? But I think that's about the only place where you could really find it, could squeeze that out of it. And in that sense, when the Greeks posit that natural state, they're doing something different than I think what we find in the Old Testament. Yeah. But it's a terrific problem worthy of a doctoral dissertation.
Yes, Brenda.
I wonder if you could flesh out this a bit more, because in both of your examples, we can just take freedom to mean choice, the ability to make choices. So with the laundry and that, is that what freedom is about?
Well, if I sniff around what I think is lurking in your question, I, of course, agree that generally when we speak of freedom, or when we speak of freedom properly, we are always speaking of an ordered freedom. And that is lurking already in the law, as I read it, in the covenant with Noah, the first covenant, let me phrase that, the first explicit covenant in the Old Testament, with Noah, the first relation that is explicitly described as a covenant in the Old Testament with Noah, there's a restriction on human behavior. And it's a restriction we accept, and we understand freedom does not mean the freedom of Miss Foley, absolutely fed up with this talk, to pull out her knife and stab it into my heart. No, to stab it into my weak heart. We don't understand that as an exercise of freedom, but as an exercise where she has to be rushed off for psychiatric care, at least, and then presumably prosecution. So, I know. The price you pay for sitting up front. That's because those who sit up front are always the best students. So, isn't that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to if you're born a slave and you remain free, then what would you call that if it's not freedom? Would you be technically, when your master lets you go from doing work, would you be technically being put into debt to your master? So, is that what we...
When you become released from the debt.
No, if you're born a slave.
Oh. Well, if you're born a slave, you're a slave.
But aren't there cases where a person is born a slave, a master would let that slave go from doing work?
Yes, then they are set free, and we could use any of those words. You know, I mean, another way to approach what I'm trying to circle around. You know, obviously, when we read the Bible, we read it in English. Yes? Yeah. And there's a translation that takes place. And particularly for the Old Testament or for those ancient Mesopotamian laws, we're translating from a language that's not even in our language family. You know, Greek is at least related to English, but these are Semitic languages. And when I say we have to read with humility, one thing that it's not just a question of the distance in time, but we also have to be careful because particularly for the Hebrew, we want to make sure the translation, how accurately we are rendering their words into our words, and our words are obviously informed by our understanding of those words, and we have to be a little bit careful when we start focusing on their words. I mean, that's why it's really a pain, you know what, for a well-paid translation committee to come together and produce, let's say, the New King James or the New Jerusalem Bible, or the NRSV or NIV or whatever you're using in your ACS. I have to say I like Core Humanity so much better. The ACS seminars. And we have to be a little careful because there are a lot of things that can be lurking here. Yeah. You know, let's take in the New Testament. You know, a word that can be a little bit complicated, I think, is the word grace. Now, you know, what exactly did they understand by that? How do we understand it? How did they understand it? Particularly for the apostles who, you know, are reading the Old Testament in Hebrew. What Hebrew word corresponds with that? Yeah? So these are interesting problems, which are not your problems in ACS. Yeah? But they're nonetheless problems out there. And I think you should at least hear about them. Know about here's a complication. Now, it may be at some point a couple of years, are you a freshman? It may be a couple of years from now when you're a junior or senior, and if you can find, you know, a congenial, friendly professor at Villanova and it shouldn't be hard to find one like that. No, I'm serious about that. I don't know how lucky you realize, how lucky I don't know if you know how lucky you are at Villanova to have a program like ACS or the Ryan Center or a humanities major. These are rare occurrences, unfortunately, today in our universities. So you have found a congenial, friendly professor, and you say, I want to, write a junior's honors thesis or something or whatever on laws and slavery.
So I was asking if, using that definition of freedom back then, would a slave that was born a slave, when he is let go by his master, would he see that as a debt to his master?
No, they'd be called, you are set free.
Even though it's not being put back into the state that he was.
Right, because they're entering a new condition. Yeah, and they would say you have been set free.
Okay.
But you would have been, exactly. I think they say you would be set free. Yeah, they would have to. It may be that an idea of a almost like a natural condition is therefore lurking in their conceptions. It may be. I don't think it's explicit, though, if you follow me. Yeah.
Dr. Gustafson.
Stephen, in addition to your theme of freedom, I heard of freedom of the king needing to rule under pre-existing law.
Yeah.
And first of all, I have two questions. First of all, what is the relationship between this freedom and this law? And the second question is, you asked somewhat humorously, did Moses read the Federalist Papers? Now, we know that the founders read the classics a lot. Did they read the Old Testament story and interpret it in terms of law and freedom?
Well, I know for sure. Of course, how about this for undergraduate education? Well, we know that Madison, Hebrew was very good. But I don't think that Madison himself was using the Old Testament or Old Testament law as much of a guide. You would know better than I do. I know he was fluent in Hebrew. I have the impression that Madison was paying more attention to, well, it's difficult to admit, but, fact is a fact. I think Madison was paying more attention to certain French thinkers.
No, he stayed another year at Princeton to study with Dr. Witherspoon and to study Hebrew.
Yeah, I know Hebrew was excellent. I don't have the impression that he himself was looking for the Old Testament as a way, but I just don't know about that. But in France and England, and certainly earlier in New England, there were many, many, many who did. That's why I put the Christian Hebraist up there. Quite a lot. And they were very serious about it. And I won't say they were always the most careful readers, but, they did, and it may be that they were looking for things because they wanted to find them there, so they had found them before they started looking, but nonetheless they looked there. And they were not looking at Rome or Greece. And there were quite a lot of them. Germany, in France, that's very characteristic of the Huguenots and the Huguenot political theorists. It's also true, however, there were some Catholics in the Catholic tradition who did so too, in Italy, like Segonio, and in France, Baudin. There's another one, and of course England. I mean, they're all over the place in England. All across the spectrum in England. I forgot the first question.
Just the relationship between freedom and law. You had two themes, or at least two themes.
Yeah, for the ancient Israelites, they're not fans of license. There's no doubt about that. So when they're setting free, there's law. It's all over the place. And that's all over the place. What do I mean by that? Well, it's called Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's all over the place. Yeah. So they're not, that's what I meant by that rather snarky comment that They're not libertarians. You know.
So freedom carried with it a moral component? Is that?
Absolutely. And it's. I think today in the jargon of the academy, it is culturally or community embedded, something like whatever that means. But that's. Yeah.
Andy?
Well, just to follow up on Dr. Gustafson's question, what was it you think that the Christian Hebraists saw in the Old Testament that maybe Madison didn't see, or that didn't appeal to Madison? What did they see that that drew them to it as a source of political wisdom for modern people?
Well,
is that something that we should be concerned with? Just to pat on the question, you seem very, very measured in your sort of turn to the Old Testament as a possible source of political wisdom for us, whereas you seem to refer back to a more robust tradition of doing this thing. So what was it about the Old Testament that made people who were actually very close to us, historically speaking, by comparison with the Old Testament?
Well, first thing is that we're talking about, I mean, it is largely, but not entirely, a Protestant affair, the Christian Hebraists. Not entirely, but largely. Okay? They're very pious. It means they take their Christianity very seriously, and they want to know how to set up a Christian society in this world. Okay? Now, in their desire to do so, where should they look? They're not going to find that in Plato or Aristotle, right? As Christians, what does it mean to set up, a society in this world that God would approve of? Well, lo and behold, they already have an example for that, and it is where? The Old Testament. Yeah. I mean, it's not in the Gospels, right? Yeah. It's in the Old Testament. So they're Christian, and looking at the Old Testament, they're not Jews, hence the category Christian Hebraists. And they find all sorts of things there. If you focus on the 12 tribes, the pre-kingdom 12 tribes, some found an argument for a very developed conception of federalism, where the tribes were federated together.
Get outside.
Well, and that was prominent. The Dutch really went in for that. And if you know about our historian of the Netherlands will say, well, of course, the Dutch were strong for that, and they're the key figure is a person called Althusius. That's what they found. Now you could say, well, they were looking for it before they even started. They found it before they even looking. Sure, maybe that's the case, but in this particular case, I just use that as one example. The kinds of things that we're looking for. The Huguenots were very interested in this because they opposed. Well, gets us a little bit of a. They opposed. What is the source of law? Is the source of law what is promulgated by the state and the king? Well, there is people who say, no, that shouldn't be the law. The law shouldn't be whatever the king says. And some people view that as the tradition of Roman law, rightly or wrongly. They viewed that as that was what was in the continent. And I said, no, that shouldn't be how we view the law. The law should be something based on something. The nature of the law, the development of the law, shouldn't come from that. And you find that in England. I don't mean to drop names, but I guess I do mean to drop names. You find that in England with a fellow like Francois Hauptmann. You find it all over France. Hauptmann in France. You find it all over in England, where the people, the champions of what became known as the common law, viewed the development of law in the Old Testament and later as a sort of an example of what they were doing, where laws developed through discussion of judges and the courts, and it's not just what's passed, just not the desire of the king or president or passed by the legislature, but law should be something different. So that they found a lot of different things. Yeah.
So my question is more broad. So you referenced how the Christian Hebraeus went back to the Old Testament because there was an example set out there and how Protestants, especially those were more partial to, like, let's say, Revelation, whereas there is another part of Western tradition that, of Athens and Rome that really highlights reason and not just, like, interpreting a text that's already there, but kind of creating law and human law. So why do you think there is this, like, impulse to kind of just reject that or just not, like, think of reason as a great way to establish a political community where, like, revelation is how we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to be? So.
I'm not
Can
sure.
everybody hear the question?
Okay, I'm not sure if I've understood your question, but I'll answer it anyway. And if you're dissatisfied with my answer, you'll say, let me know. Okay? I'm going to approach your questions, I understood it this way. One of the purposes of my little talk with you today is not to deny at all the importance of the tradition from Greece and Rome for us today. It was really only to give an elbow and say, hey, there's something else here too. And that they both have come together. That's the first thing. Okay? So there's these different streams of tradition. That's the first thing. Second thing, I myself had never quite appreciated as much as some people think I should the distinction between reason and revelation. Okay? I find the revelations in the Bible quite reasonable. Now, one could say, well, you're holding them to a criterion, yeah, and whether or not they are or not reasonable. So let me put it a little differently. Within the Bible, well, let me just stick with the Old Testament. Within the Old Testament, there's a lot of argument going on about what to do. We maybe don't take a step back and appreciate that. Sometimes it's implicit. Sometimes it's explicit. I'll give you an example of both. First, explicit. I think that the ACS seminars probably don't go past Genesis 11. But, you have to cover a lot of material. You can't cover everything. Yeah? And, you want to get on with your major and so forth. So, that's. So there's pressures of, and your teachers face the pressures of what to do with this limited amount of time, what to cover. But if you got to Genesis 18, you have Abraham standing up and he says, he doesn't quite put it this way, so allow me. He says, what the hell's going on? I can't believe that you, God, would do something like this. That can't be the way you operate. Is it? So there's a probing there. And you see that probing intention, and there it's explicit, and you see the probing explicitly in a lot of the prophets as well. And you certainly find it explicitly in the book of Job. And, I suppose also in Ecclesiastes. This probing, explicit. Now here's an implicit. As you know, in the Old Testament, there's a requirement, that guys go under the knife. Yes? Circumcision of the foreskin of the penis. Right? Yes? Yeah. Okay. What's very curious is that in Deuteronomy, 2 times in Deuteronomy, and then once in Jeremiah, there's a phrase, circumcision of the foreskin of the heart. Now, that's a really odd metaphor. We assume it's a metaphor because the ancient Israelites were not open heart surgeons. Right? So the author of this phrase, circumcision of the foreskin of the heart, had to have been aware of the other kind of circumcision, right? And if, because it's such an odd phrase, circumcision of the foreskin of the heart. So odd that, of course, that has in mind circumcision of the foreskin of the penis. But now it's circumcision of the foreskin of the heart. You follow me? So the question that then arises, is there something going on? Is the formulation circumcision of the foreskin of the heart an argument that either the previous circumcision is either A, inadequate, or B, has to be supplemented? Is the circumcision of the foreskin of the heart a commentary within the Old Testament? Is there a commentary going on within the Old Testament? I can't say for sure. No one can prove it. But the questions arise precisely because what an odd phrase that is, circumcision of the foreskin of the heart. It invites the speculation. Okay. In other words, there's this probing, consideration, dissatisfaction, trying to work things out. All right.
We have time for one last quick question. Yes.
I just have a question as to whether the idea of freedom being restoration to an earlier condition, does that have any application in your writings or readings with regard to the American Revolution and what people were desiring at that time? In other words, were they seeking freedom, but were they also, at least initially, expecting to be restored to that condition, which is freedom from a monarch, or just...
Oh, that's a terrific question. Probably Professor Sheehan's better qualified to answer me, but I'll take a crack at it. Since I'm leaving soon. She's here all the time. I'd say it's operating 2 ways. First of all, of course, for the slaves brought over from Africa and sold in slave markets, for them to be free is for them to be restored to a condition before they were slaves. And I think that corresponds to how we use the English word liberate. You're liberated from the bondage. You're free from the bondage. And then you're restored to a condition before you were dragged off in chains. As to the other way, I think you're 100% right. We want to be a condition, at least, let's say, before 1776. We demand that our rights as British subjects be restored, and that there should not be taxation without representation. Now, we want to have the same rights as any subject of the king.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Grosby, I want to thank Chris Daly and Andy Bovay, who have worked hard to bring Dr. Groudsey here, and particularly the learning communities who are part of today's event. And also, just outside the room, there's some literature about the Ryan Center. If you're interested, we'd love to see more of you. And there's also treats and refreshments. And so please help yourself. Thank you very much for coming.